Okay, we are there, Facebook and Live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to History Matters. And so does an enormous, well, you can't see it. There we go. An enormous mug of coffee. Today we're going to talk about foreign influence. And I don't have to explain why. I addressed it several years ago. I went to look and see what I said. And what I could see is that I have more things to say now. But before I get into those things, I turn to my wonderful partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and I'm delighted to be here with you all every Friday. I'm very interested in this topic because it sounds like there's going to be geography involved, which y'all know is my favorite. And I do remember that talk, and I'm sure you have a lot more to say. So here's how this works. You can continue to chat throughout the talk. But if you have questions about today's topic, we really need you to put those down below in the Q&A. I'll come back in about 30 minutes and we'll have a discussion.
Wonderful. Okay. And I will say, as I do always say, that if you're new to this community, if you're showing up for the first time, or if it's one of the first times that you showed up, please say so in chat, and you will get a robust welcome from the History Matters community. This is our 232nd episode, which is, I do this every week. I'm like, how did that happen? Somehow it happened. So at any rate, welcome. I didn't have to think a long time this week to decide what to talk about, given that the question of foreign influence of Russia trying to influence our ongoing election, and of course, it's something they've been doing for a long time. But now it's immediately in the news because I believe it was on Wednesday that the Justice Department announced that they were seizing 32 internet domains used in Russian. I'm reading from a Justice Department quote that I pulled from a document from them, so I'm not making this up. 32 internet domains used in Russian government-directed foreign malign influence campaigns that the Russian government and Russian government-sponsored actors have used to engage in a covert campaign to interfere in and influence the outcome of our country's elections. That last part is from Attorney General Merrick Garland. Now, it's interesting. I am gonna talk about particularly about 1796 today, but which is the first real presidential election in American history, because it's the first one where George Washington wasn't running, and it had a problem with foreign influence. So one of my points today is going to be, this isn't a new problem, but there are components of it now that are new. But I do want to mention one or two other things about what the Justice Department said and what the indictment said regarding the current unfolding issue. And I will say, folks, this is unfolding, and there's all kinds of stuff that I can't say anything definitively about because I don't think anyone definitively knows. There's all kinds of claims that people and Americans involved in this didn't know that they were being used by the Russians in this way. I have no idea. There's all kinds of things that are up in the air. So we just don't know. And I'm not going to make guesses at all. But what the documents that were gained by the Justice Department and a variety of other things make it clear that the Russians really were eager to, quote, reduce international support for Ukraine, because never forget that Russia really just wants to take over another country and make it theirs, Ukraine, bolster pro-Russian policies and interests and influence voters in the United States and other countries, which is worth noting here too. And Garland said the videos were, quote, often consistent with Russia's influence in amplifying U.S. domestic divisions in order to weaken U.S. opposition to core Russian interests, particularly involving Ukraine, but not only. Amplifying U.S. domestic divisions. That was the goal of this attempt by Russians to influence our election. Supposedly, some of the themes that were seen as important to touch on by these American outlets for Russian propaganda were encroaching universal poverty, right? Oh no, we're having domestic problems with poverty. privileges for people of color, job loss for white Americans, the threat of crime from people of color and immigrants. Obviously, there's a strong racial component in all this. There's, American racism is certainly no secret. That's being played here. The fact that we see so much talk about, increasing poverty, unaffordable high prices, people of color being privileged, the threat of crime for people of color and immigrants, which former President Donald Trump has been, I guess, I don't know what you call it on Truth Socialing posts about. These are not new ideas in our political forum. Clearly, this suggests that those are all themes that were seen as having real resonance and relevance for Americans. And here's part of the problem is, we cannot sit here and say, well, this mention of job loss for white Americans obviously comes from the Russians. Some of it did, some of it didn't, and we just don't know. And that's part of the strategic deployment of propaganda. Supposedly, the target audience of this campaign was Republican voters, Trump supporters, supporters of traditional family values, and white Americans representing the lower, middle, and middle class. And the focus in particular was on residents of swing states. Surprise. Okay, so essentially, it's a plan, a propaganda campaign. What's being described here is a propaganda campaign structured and put into place by the Russians using American operatives, perhaps knowingly, perhaps unknowingly, and I'm not going to make any kind of a statement about that, to influence the election in part by stoking divisions, by turning Americans against each other. And of course, creating chaos is a very useful ploy if you're trying to, number one, get a change in a presidency, right? We don't want more of this. We need something new. And number two, getting a candidate in play who says, I alone can fix it. So you can see the pieces, you can see the logic of what's unfolding now. Keep your eyes open because I think this is, who knows, feels like tip of the iceberg, but I have no idea. However, my larger point here is that this problem, the threat of foreign influence, particularly in American elections, does indeed go back to the dawn of the Republic. And part of the reason why that is such a big threat, and this is a theme I've talked about many times before here on History Matters, is because a democratic republic, a republic, to a degree far greater than, for example, a monarchy, is grounded on public opinion. And the public can be swayed. This is part of why Federalists particularly distrusted democracy, in part because they thought, well, the democracy means the public gets to decide things, and what do they know? And they can be swayed, so we need to work to limit the amount of influence that the public can have. Obviously, that is not necessarily in line with where the United States was evolving, but that was the logic of it, was if American governance and government is grounded on public opinion, then that's really variable. That can be really easily influenced. And there you get the threat of foreign influences who can find one way or another, and this particularly in early America, when this was a brand new nation without a lot of precedent, without a huge bureaucratic anything behind it, right? Very small, very new. It was easy to imagine foreign nations, long-lived foreign nations, empires, finding ways to influence American politics in ways that perhaps Americans wouldn't realize. It was a big threat, and I'm going to offer a little bit from that time period about why it felt so threatening and what the big deal was. Now, some of you may remember, I think when I talked about this a few years ago, I mentioned George Washington's farewell address, September of 1796. And he mentions explicitly foreign influence, the threat of foreign influence in the farewell address for good reason, because that was a moment, not just in 1796, a little before that as well, when the French were assertively trying to influence American politics, because they had, on the one hand, Thomas Jefferson, who would be friendly to France and who France preferred to have in office. And then you had the Federalists and Adams and Hamilton, who were not going to be as friendly to the French and were going to be far more friendly to the British. So France, and again, they were our friends, right, from the Revolution. They allied with us. They had kind of an insider track. France was very assertive in this period in trying to influence things that, in a way that would help France and hurt Great Britain. And of course, France and Great Britain were longtime enemies. They were constantly coming up against each other. So it made perfect sense. I think I've talked about this before, that throughout the early national period, or the early part of the early national period, America, the United States, was just caught in a battle between these two enemies, in which America would do something friendly towards one, say towards England, and then France would do something nasty back. And then America would turn and say, oh, no, we'll make nice with you. And then Great Britain would do something nasty back. And so that's a reason why you have a treaty with England, the Jade Treaty, then you have the quasi-war with France. Then you have the War of 1812 with England. You can see the ping-ponging back and forth. So, you know, America was already caught in a web of complication from foreign influences. But here's what Washington says in his farewell address. He said that the spirit of party particularly, quote, opens the door to foreign influence and corruption. Imagine that, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. Thus, the policy and the will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. I'm going to say that again. Through foreign influence, the policy and will of one country are subjected to the policy and will of another. Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, he's not a great writer, is Washington. He puts in parentheses, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens, right? I mean this is important. The jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. So there he's saying it outright. This is a big threat. It's a big threat to any kind of a republic. We need to be aware of that. And he's saying this here in his farewell address, partly because it's a logical thing to say as we're moving off the scene, partly because in this period, France was very eagerly trying to influence American politics. They were not thrilled with the Jay Treaty. They did whatever they could to make that unpopular. And then they shifted to the 1796 presidential election. So this is the first real presidential election, the first one when Washington's there, and as long as he was on the stage, he was going to be assumed to be president, despite the fact that there were elections electing him. But now we're in 1796, and French minister Pierre Auguste Adet really took assertive steps to to push Americans to put Thomas Jefferson into the presidency in 1796. So he did what he could to suggest to the public in public venues that France might suspend relations with the United States, and that Jefferson's victory in the coming election would prevent war, would make everything good. So in one way or another, in newspapers, he publishes a series of things suggesting that unless Jefferson is elected president, the United States faces trouble from France, which is pretty darn direct, right? He said, Adet himself said, in case you're wondering if there was a direct connection between his statements and the election, he wrote back home to people and said that he had these statements, this idea, printed in newspapers, quote, to arouse the attention of the public at the moment of choosing the electors, who in turn must choose the president. Okay, I said this, and I put it in newspapers, strategically timed, right when people are going to be choosing electors to choose the president. So yes, I'm thinking about the election. Now, here's the interesting part. Some newspapers, you couldn't miss it, they saw this and they responded powerfully. Now, we are talking, as Washington said, about party passions, the spirit of party. So Republicans are going to be more friendly towards French overtures. Federalists are not going to be happy about French overtures. So Adet has his statements printed, particularly in the Aurora in Philadelphia, which is a Republican newspaper. Federalist newspapers had a very strong response. So one Federalist newspaper writer told Americans, quote, to be on your guard. This is the crisis when foreign powers will make their great effort to secure a lasting influence over your affairs and direct your government. Another essayist who signed his name National Pride said, quote, if the choice of a president of the United States is to depend on any act of a foreign nation, farewell to your liberties and independence. I'm going to read that again. 1796 newspaper objecting to France's attempted influence in the presidential election. This essayist writes, if the choice of a president of the United States is to depend on any act of a foreign nation, farewell to your liberties and independence. You are no longer an independent nation if your political fate is being shaped by others. Interestingly, this whole French campaign may have harmed Jefferson as much as helped him, because there was a lot of publicity about how the Republicans were seemingly a tool of a foreign power. So on the one hand, this seems like a powerful way to sort of get in and influence things. On the other hand, it was so blatant and so out in public that it could easily be pointed to, and the Federalists could easily say, these guys are just tools of France. Do you really want to elect them? And so in the end, Thomas Jefferson does not become president in 1796. Now, it's worth noting when we turn back to more contemporary efforts, it's tempting to focus only on the foreign nation. So in 1796, France, and current moment, Russia, and to point them out as the enemy, which indeed they are, but it's important to note these usually, particularly in the case of now with Russia, it's seemingly a transactional attempt at influencing the election. And by that, I mean, yes, so Russia wants to influence our election. So what do? Seemingly, they appear to be paying certain American influencers to produce propaganda in line with what the Russians want. And again, I'm saying, just put alleged above my head here, because we do have an indictment, we do have evidence, but this is an unfolding story. But regardless, in a way, we're talking about something that involves two parties. One party that wants an outcome in an election, and another group of people that is taking money to produce propaganda, whether they knew that the money came from Russia or that they were producing propaganda. They are claiming they did not know, and I will not make a statement on that. But the important point here is that it's not a one-way street. It's a two-way street. And this gets back to Washington. The spirit of party invites this in. That's what this scenario potentially opens up. Now, it's important to note, and I can't now remember which press outlet said this, but it's the only one that did, and I realize it is important to note. It is important to note because this involves our belief, our faith in the electoral process. There is no evidence of successful efforts, foreign efforts, to swing an American election by changing vote tallies. So what we're talking about here when we talk about foreign influence is trying to influence Americans to vote a certain way. And it does not appear that foreign influencers, Russia or China, are messing with actual, machines and ballots. That's a different process. That's not a direct. It's important to note that because we need to think carefully about our electoral process. We need to have faith in our electoral process. It is being targeted and questioned and attacked in a variety of ways, and I don't want to contribute to that. So my point here is about swaying how Americans will vote. Now, here's one of the ways in which what's happening now is not necessarily brand new, but distinctly of our era. And those who have been here for a while and know the sorts of things that interest me are going to know immediately how interested this made me. The Associated Press said, and this is their quote, I'll quote them first, Moscow may be attempting to capitalize on the skyrocketing popularity of right-wing podcasters, live streamers, and other content creators who have found successful careers on social media in the years since Trump was in office. In other words, technology being used in a different way, new technologies, a new technological landscape is potentially being used by Moscow, by Putin, by Russia, in their attempt to sway this election. So it's no accident that they're reaching out to online influencers of various sorts. And of course, what's interesting about this is that's less obvious, right? It's not like a day going to a newspaper and saying, France will hate you if you vote for John Adams. Very different thing if American influencers are saying something themselves, and if many of them are with similar messages, you know, when someone says to you, maybe that's a propaganda campaign, you can frame it that way and see it that way, but it's definitely not as blatant as this, you know, much older attempt at foreign influence. This is Americans, knowingly or unknowingly, producing Russian propaganda and doing it explicitly to highlight ways in which divisions, American divisions, things that turn Americans against each other, things that people would be saying with or without the Russians, but the Russians are playing them up in the hope of having the electoral outcome that they want. This is one example of many, the fact that technology fundamentally shapes democracy. I talk about that all the time because I find it fascinating that, as I've said before, you're going to have to deal with me saying it again, that democracy, American democracy, is essentially a process in which the people in power have a conversation with the people they give power to. Democracy is a kind of conversation back and forth between power holders and the people who give them that power. And anything that shapes that conversation shapes democracy. That's where technology fits in. When technologies get into the communication between people with power and the populace, that's ripe for really fundamentally shaping democracy, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in not good ways. And this is just a prime example of how technology at this moment, and again, as the Associated Press says, since Trump was in office, there are all kinds of new kinds of live streamers and content creators and influencers that weren't there before, that are there now, and that are seemingly very logical targets if you're trying to produce a propaganda campaign. If you're Russia and you want to influence an election, these technological producers, newly important ones, become really logical tools. Now, I want to make a point here that White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said, apparently on Meet the Press. And it's important because I framed this. I talked about party politics. George Washington says it's about party politics. This White House National Security Advisor said, this is not about politics. It's about national security. It's about a foreign country, a foreign adversary, seeking to manipulate the politics and democracy of the United States of America. And that's an important thing to bear in mind, is that this isn't just on a, you know, Democrat versus Republican, here's an election coming way of thinking. This also involves national security. It is a foreign nation, not just trying to influence an election, but really trying in some way or another to affect the sovereignty of the United States, to have influence, known or unknown, over what's going on in the United States, which affects our status as an independent nation with our own right to shape, control our politics, our present, and our future. It's pretty fundamental as a threat. So it's not just party politics. There is a national security dimension, and there is a broad dimension about, are we an independent nation capable of shaping our own fate, of asserting how we want our politics to be? And when I say we, I mean the nation at large, and also we as American voters. We are supposed to be able to do that. Foreign nations are not supposed to be able to directly intervene in that process, even if it's just trying to sway public opinion. So this isn't just, darn, this party is behaving badly. This becomes an issue of national security. Regardless of how this ends up unfolding in days and weeks to come, we need to be keenly aware that our form of government, grounded on public opinion that feeds into, hopefully, free and fair elections, is vulnerable to this kind of threat. We need to recognize this threat as being out there. We need to have it in public awareness, and we need to think about it as we're reading whatever we're reading. Again, as ever, if you read something or see something in one way or another, if information crosses your path that gets a strong response out of you of fear or panic, pause for a moment and consider that someone may want you to be feeling fear and panic. Now, this is not to say that sometimes things don't merit fear and panic, but my point is there are foreign influences who want us as Americans to feel a certain way and thereby vote a certain way. And we need to know that. We need to bear that in mind. And particularly right now, keep your eyes open. People keep saying October surprise. Maybe it's a September surprise. I don't know. And some of this isn't surprising given the long-term history of Russia and American elections, but still, keep your eyes open and think about what you're consuming in the way of information, and where it's coming from and what it's saying, and if it might be coming from someone who's more interested in producing a reaction than in giving you information to consider and judge of your own. 1 minute ahead of time. So good. Okay. Hang on a sec. I'm going to have to strategically figure out, there's the mug. For those of you who are here and have not been here before, for 230 now, 2 weeks, I have a mug that I produce at the end of my comments that in some way or another reflects what I'm talking about. Sometimes that's a long stretch, but I have done it. I do not have 232 mugs. However, oops, lipstick off. This is the mug I produced for today. I think, well, I'll read it first. It says, "The advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only guardian of true liberty." James Madison. And I think someone out there gave me this mug, and I never can remember who. But the point of this, that knowledge is the only guardian of true liberty, directly relates with what we're talking about today. Propaganda relies on the lack of knowledge. Propaganda relies on gullibility and emotion. So knowledge in any number of ways is part of the guarantee of American liberty, and that needs to be thought about and acknowledged now in the months before an election, with Russia clearly in one way or another trying to play a role. Okay, those are my comments. Let me open chat so that I can, so that I can see what folks are saying, and we can, there we go. We can begin our Q&A. And I will say, for those who are here all the time, my background is blurred for the first time because I'm moving and packing, and it's scary back there. So in case you were wondering, that's why. Okay. Oh, I cannot hear you, Annie.
Sorry about that. The Q&A was covering up my controls. I was going to say, I took a picture because I've been documenting each week for the last 3 weeks, your progress. So to me, a blurred background means progress.
There has been progress made.
Yeah.
There has. Yes, so that's good. I know I've been feeling pressure from this
Oh,
community.
I don't want to pressure you.
No, but I have. I'm like, it better be different.
We're like coaching or cheering.
Okay, coaching or cheering.
Or you're packing coaches. Okay. And we have a ton of new people and people who this is only their second visit. It's so exciting.
Wonderful.
Love it.
Wonderful.
Yep, it's been really great. Okay, so our good friend Kathleen V says, "I've seen recent attacks on referendums, especially in California, wondering if that might be coming from a foreign influence to cause division, but I have no proof. Can you explain the history of referendums? Is it good for democracy, or should it be something always filtered through the representatives we select? Because the average person doesn't have the time to understand referendums and those critical of them, what they say.
Okay, so I can't speak specifically about California and whatever's going on now in the way of referendums because I don't know. You know, I will say it's truthful, the last point there, that referendums are difficult because people don't necessarily have the time or ability, or even some people desire, to figure out what a referendum is, how it's going to shape things, what the impact is going to be. They can be really problematic. I'm not going to respond to that by saying there should never be referendums, because I don't know if that's the ideal outcome. I don't know if I'm going to have the solution, but I do think that they represent a political liability for sure. And I suppose in that vein, it could be a liability of many other kinds as well. So it's a really good caution. I certainly, when I vote, there are sometimes referendums on my ballot that like passed right by my radar and I didn't focus on them. And then you're there trying to figure them out, in the voting booth, not knowing. You can't say, oh, I won't vote for this because I didn't know about it. Well, that might be a bad thing to do depending on the referendum. So I will agree that complicates things. The glory of American democracy is our freedom to vote for and shape our future as a people and a nation. But because it's grounded on us, because our future as a nation and the future of our democracy is grounded on us, there's all kinds of vulnerabilities in that system, because we have to be informed, we have to be engaged, we have to vote, we have to do things that take effort. And we have, I think, as a nation, until the semi-recent past, taken democracy for granted. I don't think we're doing that anymore, but it took years of people screaming, including me, that democracy is fragile and it's being attacked right now. People didn't necessarily want to believe that. Some people still don't. But the larger point is democracy has holes in it. Doesn't mean we shouldn't have a democracy, but it means that we need to be engaged and informed, and that takes effort, and that's hard, and that creates gaps for, among other things, foreign influences to weave their way in and try and get what they want instead of our being able to guide what we want.
And I know we don't do referendums as much as like some of the other states. It's not every single election. There's a long string of them, but I can't remember which one it was in California. It was one that had to do with same-sex marriage several years ago. I think they made a play out of it. And I remember my students were asking, it looks like the wording of it is supposed to trick you. Like the kids were really concerned that the language was purposely, the way it sounded made it sound like you were voting for it, but really what you were doing was voting against it. And I don't remember exactly how it all went down, but I remember the kids were really upset and they were asking us as the grownups to help them. Yeah, Prop 8. Thank you. Lots of money.
Right, because you can slip all kinds of things into referendums. Absolutely true. Someone has said Scotland would like a word about truth in referendum. So I do need to allow that to have its moment spoken aloud, because I focus on the United States, I focus on American democracy, but I did say, I didn't emphasize it, but the indictment of whatever's going on right now between with Russia and propaganda, it does say it's not just the United States that Russia is reaching out to influence and shape their politics and their elections. So, we're vulnerable, but we're not the only ones. And that's worth noting too.
So since my trip a couple of years ago, I follow a little bit of news from Australia and New Zealand, and they're talking about the same thing. And they're also talking about the manfluencers and the toxic masculinity that are trying to kind of get these boys to become white nationalists. So it's interesting to see the parallels. All right, so our good friend Gloria is back with us.
I want to say Nancy Walker says Brexit, and in some of what I was reading this morning, indeed, that was brought up as a great example of something that people didn't have a full understanding of what it was, and then there they were. So I'm sorry, move on with the next question. I apologize.
And someone also mentioned David Cameron earlier in the chat. Okay, so our good friend Gloria is back with us. Gloria asks, she says, crime and high rates are there. Inflation is real, not propaganda. How do we know that Garland is not partisan himself? Have you seen the evidence?
Well, and it's a good question about propaganda versus fact, right? So yeah, inflation is, there is inflation. There are aspects of the economy that we ought to be looking at. There is crime. If someone, well, in the mode of crime, if someone is saying, people of color are criminals and they're destroying the safety and security of our nation, that's propaganda, right? You don't single out a group and say they alone are evil and responsible. That's clearly propaganda. Propaganda, successful propaganda, relies in part on the fact that there are aspects of truth within it, right? So we can't say, and never think about inflation, never think about crime, we can think about all those things. But when people are trying to blame particular targets for those things and play them up and exaggerate them in a way that seems more devoted to getting people emotionally engaged and less devoted to simply offering information, there's a difference. So if there's someone talking about the economy with actual information in a balanced way, that's different from, oh my gosh, the economy is horrible. It's worse than it's ever been. And it's all the fault of the Democrats and Biden. That is not a calm and balanced way to talk about it. So, successful propaganda can't be like totally loony. It has to be grounded in some threads of reality. But that's why it can be successful, because it isn't necessarily, most of the time, totally loony. Yeah, there's crime. So what do we do with that? Well, a foreign influencer can stoke division by saying, oh, it's all about race. This is a race issue. And suddenly Americans are turning on each other in a more aggressive way concerning race, which is, the world knows that's an issue here, always has been, still is, touch on race. You want to get Americans to turn against each other, deal with racism, be racist, encourage racism. And Americans are good at that. And that will be an easy way to influence what they're thinking. So the short answer to Gloria's question is, yes, it is true that some of the propaganda that's being thrown around out there has threads of truth within it. But that doesn't mean that propaganda isn't propaganda and that truth isn't truth. It means you need to read carefully what's being said, who's saying it, how they're saying it, what evidence they're offering for it. You need to evaluate what it is you're seeing. But again, this is why propaganda is effective. You need some effort to untangle it. So I guess that would be my semi-short answer to that question.
All right. Our good friend Dale from Williamsburg asked, was Napoleon's brother Joseph, who lived near Bordentown, New Jersey, involved in American politics representing France or his family in the early 1800s era?
I don't know specifically. I mean, I know he was hanging around. I know the Hamiltons had him for dinner at one point. And if I remember correctly, this isn't meant to be propaganda. I believe he brought his own chef.
That's an insult to the lady of the house. Wow.
It's like all these Americans.
My house with a chef.
It might have been that Bonaparte. It might have been another French visitor, but there's someone who came to Hamilton's house, the Grange, and brought foreign visitor, I think from France, and brought their own chef. Might have been Jerome Bonaparte. He married into an elite political family in the United States. I have not studied, I have not looked to see his potential influence. It could certainly, one thing that's worth noting, you can have political influence just through personal engagement, right? Political influence doesn't have to be, I shall now shape this policy. It can be, well, I know the brother of this powerful person. And if I talk to him and get him to think a certain way, it's going to weave its way in and I might have influence. So, personal interaction can be exceedingly politically effective, in part because, like good propaganda, it's kind of invisible. The public doesn't see it. And thus, it can be very powerful, can have a big impact, and you won't have people doing like the Federalist newspapers did in 1796, saying, look at this, France is trying to influence our election. And the public can say, hey, wait a minute. The sneakier and the less obvious the better, obviously, when it comes to propaganda.
All right. So our good friend Dave is with us many, many weeks, and he's got a couple questions. So I'm going to put one of them up first. He says, for sure, the public can be swayed, but now given useful Russian idiots sowing propaganda, especially in swing states, clearly one striking and unique weakness of our democracy is the Electoral College and a winner-take-all state. Foreign influence in presidential politics is too easy given the Constitution's Electoral College. Your thoughts, please.
Well, I don't want to plunge into do we need the Electoral College, because that's such a big issue in so many ways. It is true that, you know, choosing electors who choose a president, initially, actually, if you do go back to the early republic, that was a whole of influence. You know, in the election of 1800, for example, as the A Day letter says, you know, I'm going to say this before they had pick electors, and then we can influence the electors that are picked. In some states, an elector could be chosen to vote for one candidate and wouldn't necessarily have to stick with that candidate, right? So that's problematic. And so there was a Jeffersonian Republican campaign at one point in which two men broke down. They said something like, there are 134 electors in the country. You take those 70 whatever, and I'll take those 60 whatever, and we'll cover them all. We'll connect with them all. We'll talk to them all, and then we can influence the election. So, you know, that's at a time where everything is much smaller and more compact. But still, again, that is an avenue for influence and an avenue for changing things. I think, I don't know if I'm going to say that during our lifetime, the Electoral College will be seriously reconsidered. But it certainly is a topic of consideration in a lot of ways. And considering that part of why it was put in place was to put the brakes on direct democracy. And let's put something between people voting, and, you know, well, people can vote for electors and the electors can vote. That feels safer. You know, that might be a thing that, you know, is definitely worth considering. What I always think about and wonder about, of course, is how do you do that? We haven't had that kind of a fundamental constitutional amendment, really structural like that, in a very, very long time. I think I've mentioned this once before. I think I don't remember if it's on HBO. It's on some platform. There's a show that was off Broadway and now is available somewhere on TV, called What the Constitution Means to Me. And it was basically a one-woman show about, you know, she used to be like the Elks or some kind of a lodge like that would have speech contests about politics, and she would compete, and she won a lot. And she starts with that, talking about, you know, what the Constitution meant to me in those, but then she goes on to really talk about it in a broader sense in her life. And I mention this because at the end, the audience votes on whether or not they would like to ditch the Constitution and do something new, or change the Constitution dramatically. And I saw that off Broadway. And when she said, I can't remember what the precise question is, so you'll have to watch it to find out. But whatever it was, you know, maybe we need to really fundamentally do something different with the Constitution. And I remember gripping the armrest because I was like, wait, what? Did you look up? So it's an interesting, it's well done. It's in general really good, really gets you thinking about the Constitution. But that component in and of itself, it's really interesting to think about, and to think about how people talk about that and what that might mean.
Did you get to go see that show live, or you saw it when it came on streaming?
No, I saw it live, and then I got to go backstage with the woman, the star/writer. I can't remember how I connected with her. I think it was on Twitter.
Oh, okay.
I think as a political historian, we sort of connected. Anyway, I went backstage, and she had on a wall with chalk, she had made you know, one column was the nights when they voted to ditch the Constitution, and the other column was nights when they voted to keep it. And I remember not being thrilled with that vote count. I was like, I can't remember if I took a picture of it, but anyway, I recommend it.
Yeah, I wanted to see it. I think it must have been on Hulu, because that's probably the one channel I don't get, but I don't know. I'll have to look
It's
it up.
out there. It's out there. I also want to point out, just because Tim is doing the wonderful things Tim does,
Yes, he does.
he put a link to something called War, Propaganda, and Public Opinion. There it is. Heidi Schreck. I knew her name was Heidi. What the Constitution Means to Me is the name of the show I talked about. A Great Bunk Connection. Thank you, Annie. There's something a little, Amazon for What the Constitution Means to Me. See, this is the thing.
Oh, it's on Amazon? Now I can watch it.
Yeah. Tim again, Inside Putin's Propaganda Machine. So folks, as ever, there, Dale on Hamilton and Bonaparte. Folks, never forget to look at chat, even if you're not chatting, because the amazing History Matters community, the degree to which, particularly Tim, but really many people put amazing links there, directly connecting you. It's a fine and wonderful thing.
And I archive all those on our Slack channel, and I'll put information in the chat about how you can connect to our Slack channel if you like looking at
good.
Now they changed the rules. It only archives things for 3 months now. But I think I still have all the chat saved somewhere on my hard drive.
That's not good.
Anybody really was dying to have the chat from 2 years ago.
Can anyone watching us save the chat?
I know I can. I don't know. I think they can.
I mean, I can and you can, but we're anyway.
I don't know. Carolee says yes. I thought so.
Oh, okay. Well, so that's another thing you can do.
They all said they can save the liver. All right, we have time for a couple more. All right. So I love this question. I know Ben Hughes has been with us for a while. Ben, I love this question because it kind of goes back to a previous week's talk, and I love it when people make connections. So Ben, that's very bunk of you. He says, on the subject of new technologies, are there any examples of foreign powers using the telegraph or telephone to influence elections? I love that question.
Interesting. Telephone, I don't know. Because now that moves into territory beyond which I've studied elections in depth. Telegraph. I mean, I can't say January 5th, 1851, but one of the things that the telegraph did, so I suppose it's conceivable, is that before the telegraph came along, particularly in Washington, there was a closed political community of reporters, known faces, small number of people, based in Washington. The politicians knew the reporters knew the politicians could say something in Congress and then go find the reporter and make sure they were going to, or try to make sure they were going to report it the right way. So in that sense, it was a lot of face-to-face contact, and things felt, particularly to the politicians, controlled. What the telegraph did, among other things, is it allowed unknown people, influencers, to come to Washington from faraway places, sit in the visitors gallery, not in the press gallery, and see things and report things and send them around the country. And politicians, politicos, congressmen did not have control of that process. So suddenly there was a loose cannon aspect to the way in which Washington, particularly Congress, but generally Washington politics, was being covered. So if you think about that fact, that there's all kinds of, politicians can't control spin, certainly one could think that a foreign influence could plant someone there and use the telegraph. Again, I don't know the details if this did happen, but given the ways in which the telegraph sort of opened a sphere of communication involving politics that no longer anyone individually controlled, you could certainly see how that would be open to influence. It would be particularly interesting given the ways in which foreign countries were interested in what was happening with the Civil War, to see if that was a case in reporting on the Civil War, information on the Civil War. And again, this is not a thing I have studied, and so I don't know. But the question is great, because all of these things are possible, and the telegraph, as the question suggests, made things a lot more vulnerable and accessible in a way that would make this possible.
A lot of people are mentioning the Zimmerman telegram, and robocalls in the 80s and 90s.
That's true. I had not thought about robocalls.
I guess one thing I'm glad is now there's a lot of apps that block robocalls that we didn't have before.
That's true. I mean, I don't, I mean, who knows? Personally, you can hear that it's a robocall, And so, my response is click. So the influence of a robocall, I don't know. But that's absolutely true. That's a great example of the telephone. And that is also a great example of kind of along the lines of what I'm saying with the telegraph, running around the outside of mediators and filters and just connecting directly with a voter. And then that closer connection means you can say things that you might not be able to otherwise say because it's a person to robot connection.
Yeah. All right. Our good friend Miranda, who's with us pretty often, Miranda says, we as a citizen don't want foreign influences in our election, but as a kid growing up in the 80s, I watched a number of US-backed coups in other countries. How can we reconcile this do as we say, not as it's done to us mentality?
That is a great question.
She always has great questions.
That is a great question. And that is a question grounded on a truthful fact, right? The United States goes about influencing foreign nations all the time, or certainly in its history, it has. And sometimes peacefully, sometimes being engaged in one way or another with warfare. The United States has sort of identified itself as and is often regarded as a sort of guardian of liberty or guardian of democracy. That also goes back to the dawn of the Republic, when people, like Thomas Jefferson, were saying, this is great because we've lit the spark of liberty and now it will spread around the world, and it started with us. So it's all us. We are better than everyone else, and we are going to change everything. So it is true that the United States has a long and sometimes really not attractive, really interventionist, often blatantly self-serving history of involving itself in foreign countries. And that's not necessarily, I can't say that's always condemnable, but it's definitely not necessarily admirable and deserves to be considered in the light of what we're doing right now when we're considering everything else in that lane.
Okay, so two of our favorite people on the planet, Rabbi Beth and Rich Houston, have questions that I think are connected. So I'm going to do a combo of two people's questions.
Okay.
Beth said, it seems like there may be a connection between amnesia about the Cold War and the decline of teaching and learning history. Do folks who seem to be pro-Russia skew younger than baby boomers who grew up in World War II and the Cold War as current events? And then Richie's question was, are schools teaching and preparing citizens to deal with this propaganda?
Right. So this is it for anyone of a certain age and older, or anyone who's historically minded. The sea change between a Cold War view of Russia is the enemy, Russia is against freedom, Russia is about control, Russia wants to control us, Russia, I remember as a kid learning all about, Russia suppressing and attacking Jews, right? Russia was the enemy in an enemy politically, an enemy as far as their system of government, an enemy ideologically, an enemy culturally. Like Russia was the enemy, right? In a big way, even political popular culture, extreme. And there was a certain point, I don't know how many years ago, when, I remembered pausing to think, I think I saw a photograph of some Republicans at a rally or something wearing a, I support Russia or yay Russia t-shirt or something. And I remember thinking, wow, like I before like the last 2 or 3 years, I have never used memory holing as a phrase before, but having no memory of what America once thought about Russia, not saying that we should go back to Cold War mentality, but the fact that people now who are cheering on Russia have no understanding of the history of our relationship with Russia and the ways in which that's complicated and entangled, and the fact that Russia has its own reasons for doing its own things. And, again, whether you want to pick capitalism against communism, Russia is not like just our friend in the way that some people seem willing to buy in, and particularly some on the right. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, Annie, you might know better than I how the Cold War is taught, how this issue is addressed in school, but it is as though there's a hole in American memory,
I'm
about
glad
the
you
fact
brought
that
that
our
out in the question. He said, is this, and Beth also, they both kind of touched on that. Is this part of the push about the culture wars over what we teach in history and limiting what teachers can say? So if you had asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have said with confidence, yes, people are teaching the Cold War. It's a huge part of the curriculum. It's an important part of the curriculum. Now I would say it depends on what state you live in, which is a really sad answer.
wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And that's a really, thank you, both of you. That's a really important point, right? Who just said, oh, Nancy Walker, it's not just a hole, it's a crater. Yeah. Right. And it's one of those things that makes you feel a little bit bonkers when you think about the degree to which Russia, the enemy, was so assumed, was in the air, everything was grounded on it. And now, people are heading to Russia for July 4th to meet with people in Russia, influential people in Russia. It isn't examined as much as it should be. Sometimes it's raised. Questions have been asked about it in press outlets. But yeah, I think you're right. The generational component that you raised, that our younger people, skewing differently, probably in part because, as you said, Annie, some places it's not being taught at all. And even if it is being taught, people don't have like that kind of visceral cultural memory of at least something that should give you pause before you plunge in. Those are both really good questions.
And I believe it's taught everywhere, but it's not taught the way it was previous to all these culture wars, right? And in some cases, it's been minimized, I think intentionally. So that makes me sad.
Yeah, no, it's sad and actually kind of shocking because we're watching real time implications of that lapse.
Yeah. Oh, God, we have so many questions left. It's 11. I don't know what you
I know,
want
let's
to do.
do it. Let's go a little further.
Okay. All right. So our good friend Linda, who's with us all the time, thank you, Linda, says there are those who've been exposed to honest conversations repeatedly through the last few years, but they continue to disbelieve truth and argue in favor of lies. At what point do we stop expending energy on these people worthwhile to continue presenting facts and evidence to attempt to dispel a belief in misinformation?
Well, so at what point do we stop trying to get people who are believing lies to not believe lies? There is no definitive answer to that question. It is true, and you see this all the time being said in a variety of public venues, like don't waste your energy on a certain kind of person because they're not going to change their mind. I think there are two ways in which I think about that among many. One is that may be true, but if there are people in your immediate circle that you can at least have a conversation with, that's not a bad thing. If you can do something like we do here every week and bring people together to talk about things, not to hurl accusations at each other, but just to talk about things, I think that's worthwhile. I also think it's worthwhile, and this is why I'm bloviating all the time publicly. I also think it's worthwhile to respond to what's out there and say calmly, ideally, well, this is actually how this has worked. This is actually the proof for this. This actually isn't true. This actually doesn't make sense. There have to be some people stepping forward and saying, okay, in my case, I'm a historian. Here's what I can offer you as far as insight goes. It may or may not, probably won't for a certain kind of true believer change their mind, but the truth needs to be circulating out there. Facts need to be circulating out there in public. There needs to be at least an ongoing attempt to pierce the invulnerability of the cloud of misinformation, which is constantly hovering over us, particularly now during the electoral season. So, when do you stop? I don't know. But I think on a small level in your immediate circle and communities, you don't stop. And I think in a broad sense, those of us who are teachers, those of us who engage with the public in some way, emphasizing facts and truth and simply providing, not in an accusatory manner, but in a factual, evidence-based manner. Well, here's actually how this unfolded. Here's actually how this happened. Here, as people always say, the receipts. Here's historical evidence showing how this happened. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, but it needs to be out there.
Yeah. We still have 7 really great questions in the queue.
Well, for now, let's do one more. I'm going to try and be
All
fast.
right. So Kay Carlson asks, an influencer under marketing is defined as a person with the ability to influence potential buyers of a product or service by promoting or recommending it on social media. They can add serious credibility to a brand. Maybe influencers should somehow be required to be identified on social media platforms. Is that possible? Do you think that might help? With all these manfluencers, as they're called them when you.
Right. I don't, would that matter if someone was branded an influencer? I mean, I think people probably can name influencers that they follow. Like, everyone knows some, and some they agree with and some they don't. I don't know if identifying them that way would make a difference. I actually don't know the answer to that question, but my gut tells me it might not make a difference. We're influenced by influencers, and sometimes we really know who they are. True.
I mean, we know who the Kardashians are. We know who Andrew Tate is.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Do you want to try one more or?
Yeah, let's do one more.
Okay. Rebecca asks, can we talk about what balance looks like, or what it should look like in a not normal political climate?
Repeat that again.
She's asking, what does balance look like a balanced conversation about the topics? This is such a not normal political climate.
Yeah.
What should it look like? I guess she's asking.
Well, that's a big question. I'll answer it with a short, not entirely sufficient answer. Balance. Balance would be, here's what this side is saying, here's what the other side is saying. Here's how they have exactly said it. Here are the implications of this, here are the implications of that. Generally speaking, that can be balanced. But as we see nowadays, right, let us look in detail at what this person says. Let us translate for you what this person kind of seems to have said. Not as balanced. We're in a moment where balance is the issue, right? And there's was an interesting op-ed by the publisher of the New York Times, put it in the Washington Post. I encourage you all to go and read it, because it's a mix of a conversation about press freedom and coming from him in the New York Times, this is interesting. But in it, sort of buried within it, are really interestingly strange statements about neutrality and the press. And his definition of neutrality does not jibe with my definition of neutrality. So I encourage you to find it. And I know someone out here, perhaps Tim, that's it. Ron just mentioned it. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Trying to make a diff link.
Yeah, it's in the Washington Post in the last day or two. Very much worth reading, along the lines of what we're talking about. And as the New York Times, which, a major publication, I suppose you could say, an influencer, just not one person. And what does neutrality mean? And he's defining it in a really interesting way. That, and he says something like, let me see if I can get this right. People seem to want us, I'm not going to be able to do it justice. People seem to want us to abandon neutrality and attack Trump. And that's not what people are demanding, right? So why is it abandoning neutrality to actually focus on both parties in a similar way? Really interesting stuff buried in that piece. So anyway, I encourage you to go find it in the Washington Post. There it is. Sulzberger Free Press. Anyway, okay. Is there a short question?
Yeah, James Dennis asked, the US came close to dropping the Electoral College in 1970. Curious about your opinion might be on whether that would be a good idea overall.
I actually don't know. I mean,
I think we're gonna find out. I think people are talking about it.
Yeah, I was going to say, one way or another, it's going to, we're going to be talking in a more real way. I don't know. My historian who works on the founding visceral responses, I don't know what's a big change. Another part of me is like, well, might be a time for a big change. I don't know, actually. That is a short question with a short answer, because I'm not sure what I think about that. Okay.
All right.
I'm sure we have like a bazillion questions left. Well, I tell you what, I mean, Claire, as ever, send me the questions. We don't know what's going to be unfolding on this front in the next week. It might be that there's a new turn on this that needs to be talked about next week. I don't know. But send me the questions. If there's some that really need to be addressed that we haven't really addressed, I can try and weave them in. Often when the questions that are unanswered are sent to me, they are close to what we've already talked about. And so I don't normally address them the following week. Oh, that's right. What am I saying? The debate. Okay, goofy me. Yeah, no, that's what we'll be talking about next week. Is the debate. Silly, silly me. So yes, thank you, Miriam. How could I forget that? No, Pax, you don't have to send the questions if they're already in the Q&A. Then Claire will send them to me. So, okay, so now let me talk about what's going to happen. And I'm going to try and live respond to that debate. Man, oh man. But here's what's going to happen now. We are going to segue to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording what's going on here, so that we can be even freer and easier with what we're talking about and saying, talk about whatever we want to. If you beamed in through the NCHE website, you can stay right here and thank you. Poof, I see Poof in the chat already. Poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, Poof, will be in the after party. As ever, I want to thank everyone who is here for being here, for constituting this community of information and engagement in politics. We are democracy in action. And as I've said many times before, anyone can do this, right? You can pull people together in your community, pledge everyone to not scream at each other, and have a conversation in a way that will be useful. So I think this isn't a mystery. What's wonderful about this community is that we've been doing it for 232 weeks. And this is now a community where we do regularly engage in that and rein each other in if our emotions get too involved, and think of everything that we have learned from each other in being here as the History Matters community, and the ways in which connections forged here have moved beyond History Matters, which is beyond what I ever might have hoped for. At any rate, part of what we do here can be a model for more conversations, small conversations, but conversations that matter. I want to thank NCHE. I want to thank my partner in crime, Annie. I want to thank Claire. I want to thank Jessica Ellison. I want to thank John. I want to thank everybody who makes this possible. And I want to thank you guys, the community, for showing up here week after week after week and engage, creating the amazing community that this has really created for 232 weeks. Okay, so I will see you guys. Those of you who are not going to stay for the after party, I will see you guys next week. Those of you are, I guess we're kind of ready for the poof.